Very well, thank you. Well, turn our attention a little bit now towards sort of the culture that came out of pre-revolutionary Europe and how this has reflected very much in Lohengrin. You'll recall that I said that Wagner was quite closely associated with certain writers of young Germany, in particular Butzkow and Lauber. And one of the things that both Karl Butzkow and Heinrich Lauber did was they introduced into Germany a genre of play that in fact had previously been developed in Paris and was going to in fact have an immense influence on the whole of theatre throughout Europe and indeed throughout the Western industrial world, as it had a strong influence in the United States as well. Because it was in Paris that the genre of the well-made play was first developed. And Butzkow and Lauber were the two primary practitioners of the well-made play in Germany in the 1830s and 40s.
Simon, what year are you talking about when the well-made play was created?
I'm just about to start.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Now, the well-made play is not a complimentary term. It doesn't mean good play. It actually refers to a distinct genre of play that was immensely popular in Europe in the 19th century and right away into the 20th century, and it's a genre that has very distinct features. The well-made play arose in Paris in the years immediately following the fall of Napoleon, from 1815 through to 1830. Now, this time in Paris, there was an immense expansion of theatre. Paris was the first city to really benefit from the European Industrial Revolution. And Paris grew immensely, and theatres were placed throughout the city to entertain the population. But there was not a massive repertoire, or a modern repertoire, to entertain and fill the stages of these theatres. And this is where a very important figure, Eugen Scribe, 1797 to 1861, becomes very important. He was vastly successful. He was a phenomenally prolific playwright. He turned out plays on an average of one a month for his entire career. He is one of those, he wasn't a man, he was a machine. He didn't actually turn them all out himself. He had collaborators, he had students who would sort of write up dialogue for him while he actually sort of invented the plots, or vice versa. But he wrote he wrote a tremendous number of well-made plays, most of them according to a specific formula which he wrote with associates. Now, the well-made play is as follows. First, in general, the well-made play, which is sometimes set in contemporary society, sometimes in historical society, is a play that works like clockwork, a play that is a perfect mechanism. And almost all, in fact I'm going to say just about all well-made plays, begin with exposition. Somebody comes on stage, generally lower, less important figures, they come on stage and they introduce a situation. And as they talk about the situation, gradually the characters who are involved in the situation come onto the stage and they become part of the conversation. Until eventually, about halfway into the first act, or toward the end of the first act, the most important character comes in. And the moment the most important character comes in, something happens. This is the inciting moment. And you get this sense of there's been a tremendous sort of development of backstory, as we call it, through the exposition, and then suddenly the inciting moment starts, and instantly we move forward, and the action begins to develop. The inciting moment usually happens at about two-thirds to three-quarters of the way through the first act. And from then on, there is a series of climaxes and growing tension that goes throughout the play. The action will rise to a certain climax, then go down, rise again to another climax, then go down, and again to another climax. And then ultimately, these lead to the crisis of the play. This is a crisis that everybody has been looking forward to, and it was called the scène à faire, or the obligatory scene. This is the scene we have all been waiting for. That's the explosion, and then this is followed by the denouement, in which the situation is sorted out, in which we look back upon everything that's happened, and then we have a satisfactory ending. Now, there are certain other crucial dimensions to this. Almost all well-made plays operate upon a secret that is known to the audience but is not known to characters. And the tremendous excitement of a well-made play, which actually had a lot in common with detective stories and whodunits and things like this, the excitement of it was that everybody knew what the secret is, but they didn't know how it was going to work out. And so you went to the theatre and really to see how these complex stories were worked out. And actually, any of us who read, Michael Connolly or Agatha Christie or Elizabeth George, we all actually are very familiar with a lot of this. Another important thing about the well-made play is it has a rigorously logical action. One action follows on from another. It is very rational. Another important thing, action is more important than character. As I think I was talking to people last night, actually, action is always more important than character in drama, but in fact the best dramatists, of course, give us complete characters. But in the well-made play, there was no attempt to create complex characters. All of these characters were essentially ciphers in a sort of in a machine. Now, another important thing was the well-made play is profoundly anti-romantic. Very much, actually, part of this sort of this Junges Deutschland pre-revolutionary sort of rejection of Romanticism, because Romanticism was seen sort of be vague and woolly and belonging in some ways to a sort of an oppressive sort of past. The important thing about the well-made play is it provides one with clarity. And what it really does is it shows how the world works as a machine. And it had a vast appeal to the industrializing and commercial classes at the time. In fact, this was the dramatic genre of the classes coming to power in the 1830s and the 1840s, and one of the reasons after they became power, the well-made play stayed as one of the prime sort of dramatic genre right the way through until well into the 20th century. It has actually perhaps declined in popularity in recent years, but actually there are signs that in fact the well-made play is coming back into several theatres.
Farce.
Oh yes. Farce in some ways is the most extreme form of the well-made play. So people like Fado and Sardou and these people, they actually are writing within a well-made play tradition. But this, of course, we're talking here right away at the beginning of this time. Now, Lohengrin and the well-made play. This work that in fact Thomas Mann, as Geoffrey pointed out, was referred to as a highly romantic work, in actuality has a large number of features that are similar to the well-made play. One of the greatest ironies of Wagner's life is when he was a young penniless man and he went to Paris to try to find his place, and he went to Screen. Because Screen, in addition to being a writer well-made plays, was the librettist of most of the grand operas. He went to Screen and he showed him and said, "Could you please help me get this performed?" And Screen treated him with distinct lack of respect. And I think actually one of the great ironies of operatic history is Screed's libretti for the grand operas of Meyerbeer and Aubert are actually pretty poor. Wagner eventually, in Lohengrin, wrote the greatest well-made opera that has ever been written. And this is, I think, a very important thing. And this is where I find Lohengrin is such a vital work. It is actually in a profoundly anti-romantic form, but it is actually about a romantic experience. That tension, I think, is a very crucial dimension of it. Well, how is Lohengrin a sort of a well-made opera? The opening act. The characters are introduced in order of importance in the drama. We begin with the herald, and then we go to the king, and then Ortrud, depending, you've got to have some clever staging here, because she doesn't sing that much, but she's very prominent in the staging. Then there's Telramund, then Elsa, and then Lohengrin. In other words, the characters are introduced essentially in their order of importance, just as they are in the well-made play. The whole of the first act, just about, is devoted to exposition. I just played a considerable amount of it, and it's the exposition that relates to the nationalist situation in Germany. And the moment that Lohengrin appears, this is the inciting moment. This is the moment when the action can start moving forward, when we can start to solve the complex situation that has been described in the early part of the opera. The action is perfectly structured as a well-made play. We have a series of climaxes, we have growing tension. Act 2 is a masterpiece of tension. For example, the 30 minutes of the bridal procession is nothing but people moving forward, being stopped, a crisis, and then down, and then moving forward again, and then being stopped, and then moving forward. It is pure well-made playism. And this leads to the scène affaire, which is, of course, the bridal, the love duet between Lohengrin and Elsa. This is the scene that everyone's been anticipating. It's a scene in which the issues at the heart of the drama are most fully expounded. It's a scene where the issue of the secret of Lohengrin's name becomes the crucial issue. By the way, a very important issue, which I'll explain why in a few moments' time. And it ends with the highest sort of crisis of all, which is the attempted murder of Lohengrin by Talleyrand, and then the death of Talleyrand, followed by the denouement, which is really the whole of the last scene, in which we hear about where Lohengrin comes from. He tells us something that actually we all knew all the way along, because we knew the opera's called Lohengrin, but of course the other characters don't know. And then you get to the final thing is this prophecy that Germany will never be invaded by hordes from the east, and you get this, and we move into the restoration of Gottfried and a denouement that at least gives the appearance that that order has been restored. Of course, restored at considerable cost. The entire plot revolves around the secret of Lohengrin's name. What is crucial, however, is that Lohengrin also differs from the well-made play, and it differs in important respects. First, it was interesting to hear both Jim and Geoffrey last night talking about the problems with the characters in Lohengrin, that they tend to be a little bit less complex than the characters do in other of Wagner's operas, but none of Wagner's other operas are well-made plays. But in actuality, in contrast to the characters that we'll find in well-made plays, there is a very considerable strength and body and matter in Wagner's characters in this opera. Another important thing is, there's just one other detail which I should have. One thing about well-made play got really caught up in triviality, how from small events, big consequences can come. Well, Wagner does not actually give us a sort of triviality. And another important thing about well-made play had a very conservative ethos. And again, we do not really see that conservativeness in Lohengrin. In fact, one of the great achievements of Lohengrin is that the well-made play, which in many ways was really a sort of a form of comedy as it was practiced in most European theatres, in Lohengrin is actually made to carry the burden of tragic experience. And this again is a very important step forward, equivalent in many ways to what Henry Gibson was going to do about 30 years later when in Pillars of Society, A Doll's House and Ghosts, he took the well-made play and made the well-made play carry the burden of tragic experience in the spoken theatre. So, there is a strong element of the well-made play in Lohengrin. And then, of course, there is this other highly conservative, highly unromantic genre that Lohengrin is also very indebted to, and this is grand opera. And Lohengrin has many of the features of a grand opera. Again, what is a grand opera? Well, a grand opera is generic description rather than a complimentary description. Grand does not mean say, oh, that's splendid, it's wonderful, it's grand. Grand opera is a particular type of opera that was first practiced in Paris in the late 1820s and the 1830s. And in fact was cultivated at the same time as the well-made play, and as I mentioned before, Scribe wrote many of the libretti for the grand operas, so in many ways it was part of the whole sort of cultural environment, theatrical environment. So grand opera arose at the same place at the same time as the well-made play did. And grand opera was, as much as a well-made play, one of the characteristic artistic genre of performance. What are the features of the grand opera? Oh, sorry, I didn't get this one. It didn't have a nice classy little fade in. I forgot to edit it. But anyway, here we have them. It was Parisian and cosmopolitan. It was a grand opera did not have the sort of the specific nationalist associations. Even though it came out of Paris, it was not really seen, although it was initially seen as being French. It very quickly became sort of an international phenomenon. An important thing of grand opera was historicism. Grand opera complemented the 19th century desire to escape from the rather unattractive industrial environments that were growing up in the cities into a sort of into an ideal past. And in this case, even though grand opera is not particularly romantic, they did borrow from the Romantics, and in particular they saw the Middle Ages as being an ideal period of an organic society. Grand opera depends upon spectacle. It was, and sets were constructed in considerable detail. I'll show you a picture of a few sets just in a moment. Another noted thing about grand opera is set pieces. It's full of battles, riots, prayers, ballets, marches, trials, executions, political meetings, and you've got to think of all sorts of other grandiose events that occur. But the thing about grand opera was the plots were really sort of put together so you had great, massive, sweeping views of society and events that allowed for confrontations. Another thing...
I would add musical contests.
Yes, musical contests, yes. The ethos of grand opera was essentially very conservative, and in particular, society is always seen as greater than the individual. And in this way, we can see the crucial non-romantic aspect of grand opera. If you look at the operas of Aubert and of Meyerbeer, which deal with revolution and deal with people involved in the revolution, always the individual ultimately is defeated by the chorus. The chorus stands for the forces of history, and ultimately the individual is swept over by the course of history. Jane Fulcher, several years ago, wrote a very interesting book where she actually analyzes French opera from the political point of view and basically sees it as a genre that was primarily there to argue a royalist, a very conservative philosophy. So we find that there are many different sort of themes running through this genre. Now, all of this is apparent in Lohengrin. It's being seen in Germany, actually, as a culmination of both grand opera and of romantic opera. And to a considerable degree, it is grand opera. It was very much to the taste of the time. Wagner himself insisted that, in fact, the atmosphere of 10th century Brabant, by the way, is sort of up in the area of the Netherlands. Antwerp is actually where it's set, sort of in present-day Netherlands. But he insisted that sort of detail by detail, we should actually have recreated the atmosphere of 10th century Brabant. In grand opera, the romantic tends to be downplayed. But we might say that this is not the case in Lohengrin. One of the really interesting things about Lohengrin is I think we actually do have a sort of a melding of the concern of the theme of Romanticism with both grand opera and the well-made play genre that in many ways were essentially non-romantic.
Simon, may I ask you to take a detour here? You're telling us very often what Romanticism isn't. Can you define the Romanticism? I should have asked this long ago.
Actually, I'm trying to depend upon. I defined it quite a few times actually when I've been talking here. I mean, essentially, Romanticism. It's humans are natural rather than social beings. Romanticism emphasizes feeling above reason. Romanticism, I give lectures. Is what?
Sure.
Yes. Romanticism is a very strong nationalist dimension. It was Romanticism that actually helped the European nations define.
So there's the potency of archetypes, I think.
Yes, you were mentioning. Yes.
And so you can see, for instance, that covers a huge amount of bases because it would cover Why is Jane Austen different from Emily Bronte? And there you can see, you can almost define Romanticism right there. Compare Pride and Prejudice with Wuthering Heights, and then you have sort of a pole there.
Yeah, Romanticism it's strongly associated in Germany with Sturm und Drang at the very beginning. It tends to be antisocial, it tends to be very revolutionary.
And of course, yes, the use of the word grows out of, not out of romance in our usual sense of it, but rather than novel.
From the romances, the medieval romances, yeah. Does that sort of...
Yeah. I mean, I know obviously someone thinks romanticism, yes. And sometimes when you're saying this is anti-romantic, it doesn't quite...
I should have brought my checklist.
No, that's very good.
I have sort of ready-made definitions of romanticism that take 15 minutes to get.
Since we stopped, just one second that's kind of interesting about the features of Grand Opera #1, Parisian and Cosmopolitan, and this very, very ties into the first part of what your talk is to think about when Wagner went to Paris and really discovered Grand Opera, who were the big people in power there were Meyerbeer, a German Jew, Lalevi, a German Jew, Spontini, an Italian, Aubert, who was French but from Germany also someplace, Hérault, who was actually a Corsican. Nobody was French. So they were writing operas in language they to some extent didn't know.
It has been the tradition of Paris ever since.
Yeah.
Paris is the cosmopolitan city of all cities. I mean, if you look at it in the 1890s, you look at it in the 1960s, Paris has always been this tremendous attraction, and people go there and then go back.
20s, twice, everybody.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, now, so Lohengrin in many ways really is part of the whole sort of cultural world that was developed in the course of the pre-revolutionary period. Just one or two other pictures here to give you some idea of what Grand Opera looked like. This is from a record jacket of L'amour de Portici. L'amour de Portici is the only Grand Opera actually that founded a nation. It was performed in Brussels in 1830, and the audience left there and rioted and established as a result of this a few years down the line the state of Belgium. And they do, that gives you some idea of the detail that they attempted to create in the sets. This particular set of Les Huguenots had a practical staircase you see there. Of course, the building in the background was backdrop. And finally, we have Meyerbeer Le Prophète, which is here we have the cathedral scene from actual Le Prophète. Now, that is actually all my pictures for today. I'm now going to actually focus much more upon, let me just get this taken out. I'm going to focus now much more upon music.
That's cool.
That's a stand on my islands. I was there and took it in March. Anyway, now, Lohengrin is not only a well-made play, it's also a play, it also has its own very, very individual structure. Reinhard Brinkmann identified 3 levels of action in Lohengrin. I actually would like to see not quite so much as levels of action as concentric circles. And essentially we can see within this well-made play Grand Opera 3 circles of characters. And in the course of the opera, we go through the outer circle, through the second circle, into the inner circle, and then at the end, we come out again. And let me go from here now, so I don't have to hold my notes. The first of these circles is the world of German nationalism that I've already explored in a fair amount of detail. And the world of German nationalism is associated with Heinrich der Wörgler, with the choruses, etc. And this world is not to be lightly dismissed. This was, I know that sort of lots of us sit through see the curtain and say, oh my God, we've got 10 minutes of exposition, let's just sort of speak until Elsa comes in. Wagner didn't want you to do that. This is a very, very important level that we have to go through. And Wagner clearly intended the political situation to be very much to the fore. This is actually very much the world of Grand Opera, and we are actually aware of the nationalist element of this opera throughout. The chorus is present on the stage for the whole of Act 1. And then, of course, we have a more private beginning to Act 2, but the majority of Act 2 is the sort of the very splendid, well-made bridal scene. And the important thing is that Elsa's doubts about Lohengrin's identity, the very, very private part of the play, actually plays out on a very, very public scene. So we remain constantly aware of the nationalist sort of dimensions. Only in the bedroom scene does the grand operatic world that can be well represented, that can well represent nationalism, only in the bedroom scene does the grand operatic world withdraw. And this world of the public is delineated in a characteristic grand operatic fashion. I agree very much with what Geoffrey said, that this music on the whole tends to be quite conventional, but at the same time it is quite stirring in a very, very sort of, in a very elementary way. I must confess to a very guilty pleasure here, is I absolutely love the interlude between Act 3, Scene 1 and Act 3, Scene 2, the music of the gathering of the troops, which is actually one of the most sort of banally virtuoso pieces of music that Wagner ever wrote.
We all have these things to confess.
We do. I've got even worse things to confess than that, but I'm not going to. But the rhythms of the music are very clearly defined. Much of the scene is very close to the march, and I know Geoffrey's going to talk about this in greater detail tomorrow. This is a world of lots of trumpet calls, of large ensembles that have full musical development. In fact, in a way, Lohengrin is distinguished from the later music dramas, and even to a certain extent the earlier music dramas, by the fact that the action is very frequently held up by the ensemble for what seems to be primarily musical reasons. But in actuality, the dramaturgy of Lohengrin and of the nationalist dimension of Lohengrin is very, very deliberate. You get the sense of building blocks being very, very sort of definitely put into place. And one of the problems, by the way, with the Lohengrin, Lohengrin, which you can see, which we might see on the DVD this afternoon, is that he tends to cut a lot of those choruses, and you get a sense that in fact the sort of the real social world that surrounds Lohengrin and Elsa is to a certain extent diminished. But anyway, this is quite clearly a grand opera, and in it, Wagner demonstrates himself being the most accomplished of all grand operatic composers. For example, one thing that many grand operas had was the Preghiera, or the Great Prayer. And as we heard yesterday, the Great Preghiera in Lohengrin is the only part that is actually not set in 4/4 time. Here we have it, a wonderful example of grand opera. It's on page 6. grand opera, Meyerbeer couldn't hold a candle to Wagner. And of course, this is one of the great things about Lohengrin, that we have many other of those splendid moments throughout the piece. Now, what is the second level action, or the second circle? What is the circle of disaffection? It's actually in many ways of those forces that threatened the perfect unity that Germany could be. Telramund and Ortrud. And for many of us, including myself, these are the most fascinating figures in the music drama. Nominally, they are the villains of the piece. Certainly they are in the symbolic structure of the work. Ortrud embodies pre-Christian pagan religions. She worships Wodan and Freya. I love that moment when she sort of summons Wodan and Freya. I feel we're moving out into bigger and more exciting worlds. But still, the powerful residue of heathen religion is very much present with her. And they, both Ortrud and Telramund, are in strong opposition both to the institutional forces represented by Heinrich on the one hand, and the powers that Lohengrin stands for on the other. I think actually Telramund is the more interesting of these two figures. He's a fascinating creation. He's a Christian knight who has slipped back and has done so not out of belief, but out of desire for Ortrud. And as a result, he never really believes what he stands for. He is a figure who doubts, or I always like to refer to Ibsen, who is my favourite 19th century figure. Like an Ibsen character, he doubts his own doubt. He really is a sort of a broken figure who actually is capable of getting a considerable amount of sympathy from us. In fact, Wagner's genius as a music dramatist is fully apparent in these characters. If he were just writing a well-made play, or a conventional grand opera, he would really have represented them as being conventional villains. But he doesn't. In fact, as we have already recognized, he applies his most progressive music to them. Even though the big scene between Ortrud and Telramund at the beginning of Act 2 does not show the leitmotif in technique in full development as it would be in The Ring. At the same time, this is music in which words have an equal standing to the music. For the first time in that scene, we actually listen to the words very, very closely. The function of the music is to explore, to strengthen and intensify the meaning of the words, and in this way it really is sort of moving toward mature music drama. In Ortrud and Telramund, Wagner penetrates darkness of mind. This is a representation that has psychological and intricacies, and it anticipates in many ways those two magnificent creations of evil in The Ring, Alberich and Hagen. So, although these two characters are demonic, Wagner does not demonize them. He actually makes them into dramatic characters who, even if we don't sympathize with them, we understand them. We recognize that they have their own necessity. And in fact, in very effective performances, Ortrud impresses us in particular with the power of conviction, which is equal to any sort of ideology that is idealism expressed on the rest of the characters. And Telramund, in fact, I think is perhaps the most human figure in the piece. Here we have just a brief extract, page 64, from the scene between Telramund and Ortrud. I got. I think it's one of Wagner's most penetrating and disturbing lines, and we should remind ourselves that in 1847, when this was written, that probably could never actually have been said on the German stage. In fact, one of the achievements of the 1848 revolution was that Lohengrin was put on in 1850, and that scene could be staged, because it is quite clearly a scene that very strongly challenges the very conception of what divinity is. The third circle, in the center of the drama, is that that's occupied by Lohengrin. And of course, Lohengrin is one of Wagner's most enigmatic and difficult heroes. Wagner initially found him to be cold. In a communication to my friends, he says that he reminded me of the carved and painted saints that one would see on the highway. And I always wondered, to a certain extent, Lohengrin actually didn't remain that to Wagner throughout the composition, because Lohengrin does seem to be the one character that he hasn't really sort of managed to put the stuff of actual living into. Whereas we can accept, actually, even King Henry and quite clearly Telman and Ortrud as human beings who have got hot blood sort of pulsing through their veins, but somehow one tends not to feel this about Lohengrin. He's the most glamorous of Wagner's heroes. He always, or usually, comes on dressed in white or in silver. As was pointed out yesterday, in many ways he's a figure from the fairy stories. He's the knight who rescues the damsel in distress. And to a certain extent, by the way, he is associated with the military. Although, remember, he never calls himself actually a ruler of the land, he will merely be the protector of the land. Like the Dutchman and Tannhäuser, he comes from the land of the imagination, and also from a condition of eternal recurrence. The Dutchman comes from the necessity of having to travel the world. He goes around the world the whole time. Every 7 years he can stop. Tannhäuser comes from the constant repetition of sensual love. Lohengrin comes from the world of eternal occurrence, which is associated with Mont Salva, the Grail. And he wishes to find salvation through a woman who is prepared to sacrifice herself for him. Theme that we have already seen in Dutchman and in Tannhäuser. Now, of course, and Jeff is going to talk about this much more tomorrow, I'm sure, his music is very distinct. He is associated with the high strings, and there is no sense of conflict in him. There seems to be a sort of an ideal unity. He comes, in fact, from a world that is beyond that of humanity. Here we have the opening, his opening lines as he first comes on stage, page 57.
Oh,
one of the most important aspects of that extract that I gave was the influence that Lohengrin has on the chorus. This chorus that has been sort of engaged in rabble-rousing singing and everything, suddenly we find they're sort of completely subdued. He has an influence that seems to bring a calm and a unity to them. But of course, Lohengrin embodies a dilemma. He has come down to be saved by a self-sacrificing woman who will love him for what he is, not for what he stands for. In other words, he is trying to find that within him which is human. And indeed, the fact that eventually he cannot find it is perhaps one of the reasons why we never feel to be completely a human figure. And maybe this is why we should actually feel for him, because he lacks something that is necessary to be part of human life. But there are other interesting sort of aspects to this problem of Lohengrin. What he stands for has been open to various interpretations, but I actually find no reason not to believe Wagner when he actually says he stands for the artist dwelling in the highest realms of consciousness. And in this way, Lohengrin is part, as it goes along with Dutchman and Tannhäuser, as examining from different points of view the dilemma of the romantic artist. And the problem is that he makes a stipulation, and he says, Elsa must never know his name. Now, why does he do this? Does he do this just because the fairy stories always sort of have a knight coming down and one couldn't sort of ask for the name? It's a sign in many ways, if you don't ask somebody's name, that you completely trust them. It's a very familiar element from a fairy tale, and not asking somebody's name, just trusting who they are, in many ways shows that you've passed the test of love, and shows that you do love somebody just for what he is, or just for his inner being, rather than for his sort of his social or external standing. But I think with Lohengrin, there's another reason why this question must not be asked, and I think it's a very important one, because Lohengrin does quite clearly stand in Wagner's mind for the creative artist, somebody who creates out of the depths of the unconscious. Somebody who actually does not know exactly how he creates. Indeed, the essence of romantic art, as distinct from the art of the Enlightenment, or as distinct from the art of pre-revolutionary Germany, all of which is quite rational, very clearly put together. Lohengrin itself is an opera that is very, very carefully constructed. But from the romantic perspective, artistic creation cannot be questioned, because artistic creation comes from sources that are spontaneous and beyond rational understanding. And there is a sense, and many artists who actually do create from a more sort of spontaneous, instinctive understanding of the world, feel that if you question the source from which your creativity comes, then that source will disappear, and it will be no longer available to you. And I think that this is what is really at the heart of Lohengrin's requirement to Elsa, that she not ask him a question, because if she does, she will make him declare who he is, and at the same time, he will therefore betray his very creativity. Yeah,
I think, Simon, you've really touched on another deep theme here that pervades Europe. One of the times when we were interviewing the minister of defense of Britain, he said, you don't understand in this country how in Europe one is born with a feeling that you cannot advance, that you are stuck in your place in society. And the opposite of your point, which strengthens it, is made wonderfully in the movie The Blue Max. When the squadron commander asks, they're in the German Air Force, the squadron commander asks George Papard, despite his wonderful flying ability, said, and where are your people from? And he was from a laboring class, not one of the aristocratic. This theme just pervades Europe. So this longing for this white knight who will get people to recognize them for their own merits and not their background and their family.
Yes.
I think think a very deep theme.
But that lines up also with a lot of the egalitarian aspects of the pre-revolutionary period and the revolutionary ambitions. Okay, I've got about 20 minutes. I want to go a little bit more to get through, almost done that. Of course, there's one person I haven't mentioned, and this is Elsa. Well, I have mentioned her, but only in passing. Lohengrin, in some ways, actually, I think leaves many of us cold. Even in his love scene with Elsa, there's a certain sort of detached quality. He doesn't have the warm, urgent emotions that she has. He certainly is no passionate Tristan or Siegmund or anybody like that. Could, in fact, Lohengrin's coldness be a fatal flaw in the drama? And do we have here a sort of a hero who is ultimately sort of cold, and therefore this really affects the effectiveness of the drama? Well, I don't think so. I think it's only, in fact, fatal if you think that Lohengrin is the central character of the opera. But I don't think Lohengrin is the central character. Elsa is the central character. There are very good reasons for us thinking that she is really the figure who stands in the centre of the opera. For example, she has by far the longest role in the entire opera. She is on stage for the whole Act 1, almost the entire Act 2, and almost the entire Act 3. She had vastly more stage time than Lohengrin. Lohengrin actually has a very small role until the beginning of Act 3. He only comes on the last third of Act 3, of Act 1, and the last quarter of Act 2, and in both of those acts he sings mainly in ensemble rather than in solo. It's only in Act 3 where Lohengrin suddenly takes over and we have acres of music. Elsa, however, goes right the way through the opera. She is the one character that lives in each of the three circles of the action. She links them. The others all stay within their own circles. I always feel that Elsa has received a pretty bad press. I agree with Jim when he was saying yesterday that she is a character who develops. I find that she really is a strong character in this way. She's the one who feels the conflict most acutely. We understand Lohengrin's dilemma, we recognize it sympathetically, but she's the one who suffers. She's the one who really goes through the agony that Lohengrin has set up, and that in fact the political situation has set up as well. We may think of her as passive, and certainly in her first entry she's the model of submissiveness and womanhood, and very often she comes on with her head down, and she is a figure who is oppressed. But she is the one who goes through all the phases of the action. The well-made plot hinges constantly on what she does. And she, like Telramund, is a divided figure, and therefore one who I think creates a tremendous amount of interest. In fact, I find Ortrud and Lohengrin are quite similar, and Telramund and Elsa are quite similar, because Telramund and Elsa really are the ones who are divided and changed by what happens. Because she's divided, she's not perfect, but she is at the same time a wonderfully luminous figure. She's a figure of compassion. Of course, it is her compassion that allows her to bring Ortrud into her retinue at a vital moment, and therefore allows the poison that Ortrud spreads to spread that much more effectively. But when she brings Ortrud into her retinue, we have what Jim referred to, and what I will also refer to, as one of the most beautiful moments in the entire 19th century repertoire, as we feel an all-embracing quality to her compassion. And in fact, it is at this moment where she welcomes Ortrud into her retinue that we come to the ethical heart of the drama, which is, of course, that of love and compassion, something that was crucial to all the thinkers of the pre-revolutionary period.
Wagner, you're reminded of I used to sing a quick stuff. Did you listen to this? Is it right or wrong?
No, that's right.
That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, Elsa's at the centre of the gigantic procession that occupies the last 30 minutes of Act 2, which is actually one of Wagner's finest operatic conceptions and a consummate piece of well-made play writing. Essentially, the 30-minute procession is constantly being interrupted, and each interruption wears away at Elsa's resolution, while the action gets sort of bigger and bigger, and the well-made suspense sort of builds up. We feel Elsa's confidence sort of dripping away, and this is where this ambivalence is actually something that no other operatic composer writing in this tradition could have achieved at this time. But we incrementally feel her anguish, so that by the end of the scene, as we get to this great sort of climactic sort of moment as they go into the minster to be married, we know already that, of course, that marriage is condemned. And the leitmotif of the question, which had sounded so wonderful and benign when Lohengrin had first sung Act 1, suddenly comes out. Instead of being silvery and ecstatic, it becomes shot through with doubt and poison, like it's a snake. And we suddenly realize that, in fact, the poison of the second circle has fed both into the first and into the third circles. But here we have the magnificent, tragic conclusion of Act 2, page 8.
Page 8.
You have got the tone of the dissidents, and then which takes the music that sits in the center of the opera, the music of Lohengrin, and turns it into a real threat. Because at the end of Act 2, you really feel that Lohengrin is not actually bringing light and joy, that in fact he has the potential of bringing real disaster to the world. Now, in conclusion, Lohengrin, I think, is a crucial work in Wagner's dramatic output. If I may articulate a brief note of criticism of some of Wagner's earlier works, particularly Dutchman and Tannhäuser, there tends to be about them a note of self-pity, a note of special pleading. Both the Dutchman and Tannhäuser have problems, and to a certain extent you feel that as Wagner is writing about those two, he's writing a work that is trying to sort of excuse them, to specially plead for them. Particularly Tannhäuser, who at times actually becomes a really sort of confused and not particularly nice young man. But the splendor of Lohengrin is that I don't think Wagner tries to make any excuses for the alienated romantic artists. I think this is important for him, because I think in Lohengrin he has transcended self-pity. And I think this is one of the key virtues of using the well-made play and grand operatic form. He objectified his own problems and then presented them objectively in a framework that in fact we recognize as being a tragic framework. Wagner was always a romantic throughout his whole life. In fact, Tristan and Isolde and Parsifal in particular, I think, are the culminating point of the entire German romantic culture. I can't think of two works that more completely embody Romanticism than those two masterpieces. But we have to remember that Germany was much more than just Romanticism. The culture of formats that I was talking about includes the writers of the Junges Deutschland, it includes the philosophy of Feuerbach, another philosophy that I haven't mentioned is that of the young Hegelians. Furthermore, the artistic modes of the well-made play and the grand opera, neither of which are romantic, but all of which influenced Wagner, were very, very prevalent in the theatre. So I think Lohengrin is a very significant piece in that we ultimately see at the heart of the opera a romantic phenomenon, that of Lohengrin and of Elsa's love for Lohengrin. But we see it through a non-romantic, objective perspective. And this actually makes for the clearest action, and perhaps the least ambiguous action, in Wagner's entire output. But it also makes for something else that we have to remember, and that is, it is the most pitiless tragedy that he wrote. It is a really painful, wrenching work. Wagner actually claimed that people often asked him to soften the end of Lohengrin. And maybe this is one of the reasons why he wanted the second stanza in Flam and Lamb to be taken out. But people said, he said that people asked him, could you give some hope perhaps that Lohengrin will come back, that Elsa will somehow ultimately find her love again? And he completely and absolutely rightly refused to alter the ending. He wouldn't even begin to soften it, because he says he recognizes that Elsa and Lohengrin are driven by necessity, and this is the only way in which they can, their stories can end. They are what they are, both because of themselves and because of the society that they find themselves in. Elsa is in fact a woman that, if she does not know Lohengrin's name, is in fact in deep trouble. Ortrud, who is a very wise and very wily observer, gives Elsa very good advice when she says, you must know your husband's name, because in this society which is ruled by politics and by power, it is vital to know who you marry. If you do not know who you marry, you are extremely vulnerable and you can be destroyed. Your survival depends upon knowing who you are closely associated with. But furthermore, and I think this is where we all identify with Elsa, Elsa needs to know personally. Loving someone does depend upon trust, but of course it depends upon more than just trust. Elsa, I suppose at the beginning, when she's a sort of a coy little sort of Victorian idyll of a woman who sort of is utterly passive, I suppose, yeah, maybe she would be happy to sort of live in sort of ignorance of the world around her. But the great growth in the opera is the growth of Elsa. She gets stronger and stronger. We should note it, for example, I'm afraid I don't have time to play this, but in the love duet in Act 3, it is Elsa who introduces the main melody, not Lohengrin. Lohengrin always follows her musically. Elsa is the one who, in fact, introduces the music. She is the one who has the desire. She is the one who has the passion. Lohengrin constantly, as it were, is pushing her away. So she's clearly the leader. There is a growth of identity within her that she recognizes as an ultimate right. She must have the freedom to love as completely and as equally as Lohengrin does. And it is in this way that I think this is a very strongly feminist opera. It really, in fact, argues that Elsa's rights are equal to those of the men around her. As for Lohengrin can really only follow his own nature. As a hero, he's not really of this world, and the blessing that he brings is disembodied and a little bit doubtful. He relates to art, to our sense of unity and beauty as having a unifying effect on the world. But the problem with Lohengrin is he doesn't engage in the actuality of human relations, and probably he never can. And probably Wagner never could. I throw that out just as a possible question. And that Lohengrin is the one opera where he comes to face this. In other words, in this very public opera, there is a strong element of personal reckoning. He never engaged in the actuality of human relations, and you feel that if he did, he might in fact lose everything that is his. And like, if we see him as the artist, like many artists before and after him have found, if you engage in passionate relations, particularly with the object of artistic contemplation, you will destroy both that object and yourself. In many ways, actually, in this opera, Wagner is introducing themes that would later be taken up by Ibsen and Strindberg and all those great playwrights at the end of the century who were completely concerned with this issue. As Ortrud realizes, if you cut just the little tip of a finger of Lohengrin, he loses all his magic. And we all get tips of our fingers cut in human relations. But anyway, he will be no longer perfect. If you give him a human identity, he will lose his magic as well. In fact, the ending is the only ending possible, and I think the only thing that mitigates it is that Elsa dies as well, to make it even more devastating. Maybe you should keep Elsa alive for the next 70 years. Wait for her to come. Really know the utter agony that has been caused her by this. So anyway, Wagner in Lohengrin was not really concerned with arguing the rights and wrongs of a revolution. Ultimately, I think he takes no sides, and nor should he, because he is an artist rather than a politician. Lohengrin is a historical drama, but this does not mean that it's solely concerned with the historical period. As I said, in the grand sort of honoured tradition of European historical drama, from Shakespeare through Schiller, the historical period is used to sort of shine light or to sort of give some a reflection to the present age of itself. So I think there are major political issues in the opera concerning questions of unity or of dissolution through particularist interests. This was a major concern of Germany throughout the Vormärz period, and this is directly dealt with in Lohengrin. The last scene of the opera, which is introduced by what I think is one of Wagner's most sterling orchestral passages, but other people are not quite so sure. This actually provides us, when Lohengrin comes back onto the stage at the end of the opera, it provides us with a view of a reinvigorated Germany. And in his final solo, Lohengrin prophesies that Germany will never again be conquered by hordes from the east. And so, in a way, he has already brought, what is represented on stage is he has brought a power of unity to Brabant and to the empire. And this power of unity is ultimately embodied in the Grail that he describes at the very end. The Grail has two functions. It's a symbol of artistic creativity. And the spirit of this artistic creativity will dissolve the stasis of time and will ultimately create a social unity as all will recognize the beauty for which it stands. And it is this spirit of unity that Wagner puts forward as the means of bringing Germany together. He saw Germany would be brought together by the artists rather than by the revolutionary or by the politicians. The tragedy, of course, is something that Wagner recognizes actually in the opera itself is, at the same time, that can never happen. That is the real tragedy of this piece. It is through the Grail that we all get a sense of common identity. The energies released by the instinct for the beauty and power of the imagination will create a common bond, Wagner perhaps is arguing, that will unify those who are politically different, and it is in that unity that salvation will lie. At the same time, we know by the very fact that Elsa and Lohengrin separate that unity will never ultimately come about. And it is a tragedy, of course, that we still face today. So the message that we get in Lohengrin is one that actually we do see in others of Wagner's works, but I don't think it has ever been placed in as cold, as rational, and as political a perspective as it has in Lohengrin. Thank you very much. Yes.
The three factors, one of them is German nationalism.
Yeah.
It's very interesting that in the English translation, in this booklet, this is totally disappeared. And I'm referring to page 50, that's the fourth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9. But in the German text, of course, it is mentioned. That's 50, page 50. Auf Deutsch übertragen. Was Deutsches Land heißt, soll der ganze Schaden, man spielt, wo niemand mehr das Deutsche redet. It's not translated properly. And also at the very end, that you just mentioned, that's page 92, nach Deutschland sollen noch die 14 Tage des Ostens folgen, Siegel niemals ziehen. Again, it is Germany, is the key point there. Not some sort of nebulous neutral empire, as it is translated here, or in the other page. So it is interesting that even this was published in 1993, even in this European Union, and England, both England and Germany are part of the European Union, this sharp differentiation and nebulous nationalism without pointing up as German nationalism.
Well, I think so. I think, as Jeffrey pointed out yesterday, the nationalist theme is very difficult for us to deal with today because we know much more in 2007 than people knew in 1850 when the opera was first performed. And whereas I think that sort of I find myself a little bit ill at ease with nationalism. I tell myself that Wagner was not nearly as militaristic and nationalist as he sounds, but I don't entirely believe my own argument there. I think obviously it's phased down because this is an English translation of the ENO, and I think this happens regularly. For example, years ago, I saw Lohengrin of all places. Here was a bad production, the worst I've ever seen anything about. I saw Lohengrin in Leningrad. This was the days that it was Leningrad, and it was done in Russian and sounded like Mussorgsky, which was very interesting. But I actually asked somebody who was with me, who actually did have Russian, I said, what happens to the line, never shall Germany be conquered by wars of the East? And it was cut. Yes.
Is it an oversimplification, I think the way you played it out, in a word that Wagner described as a romantic opera?
Yeah.
That you have these very anti-romantic forms and structures in which the only really romantic element is the character of Lohengrin himself. Keeps trying to break into that world and ultimately famous.
I don't think it's an oversimplification. I think that this is what the basic tension is. I think that Wagner quite clearly intended the issue of Romanticism or being romantic to be absolutely central to what is happening, which is where ultimately Lohengrin is the central. Actually, Lohengrin is the central issue of the opera. He isn't the central character, if you get that distinction. But I think this is his major concern. And of course, after this, he went back to Baroque. And it's interesting that today we value the Romantic operas, the later Romantic operas, more than we do an opera such as this that does actually seem in some ways just to be dated, because it so depends upon sort of non-romantic dramatic forms of the time. Yeah.
Why can't the forbidden question simply be seen as an example of Christian faith, like something to be accepted or not?
Well, I have not provided a Christian interpretation of the play, of the opera. It certainly has been performed. Wagner, looking at his judging from the pictures I've seen in the production, must have put on a very overtly Christian sort of interpretation of it. I think Giorgio Strehler did it, a production in Milan several years ago now. I've only read about it, not seen it, but he actually really emphasized the fact that it was the battle between Christianity and paganism. So I would just go and say, yes, this is part of the fact that this is a multiple level opera. I think interpreting Lohengrin as the artist is one way of interpreting it. It does actually have the sanction of Wagner himself, and when you look in the larger context of his works, that is one very credible way of doing it. But I think it gets to the issue of trust, and of trusting your instincts rather than your rationality, which is a romantic issue. And that ultimately Elsa cannot do that. And she is not seen, I think, as being weak or in some way wrong in not being able to do it. She just cannot do it. And this is just like so one of us cannot do it. Could you live married to somebody whose name you never knew? In a way, you always do. Yeah. There's an identity. I mean, there's always that sort of that heart of that core of your partner, which you cannot get access to. But if you do get access to it, it'll destroy you.
There are any number of women that know that their husbands are mistresses, that know that their husbands engage in legal activity, but as long as they good husbands and take care of their families, they believe the same. And they're not going to go beyond that.
It's much more
This I think deals with issues of personal identity, and I don't think we're dealing here with a question of right or wrong. I mean, I certainly know that if I were in Elsa's position, I would ask the question.
No, but would she and or would she? You see, that's the issue. Or truth is there, and or truth puts that idea in her head.
Well, the order of his life, what we see, and this is why I think Elsa is a central character, we see a young woman going through life and in fact growing considerably. She's a fully mature human. She goes through a similar growth, say to like Shakespeare's Juliet, this wonderful sort of process from being sort of oppressed to ultimately being a tremendously self-aware and independent figure. Yeah, she does it through all truth. But it seems to me that any of us who actually wants to be established in the world on a position of equality with other people, our knowledge of the people we are with should be equal to their knowledge. That seems to me is an important matter. Yeah, Jennifer.
I just got one very interesting story-flying thing, which resonates, I think, in the ring a little bit, is to look at how both Friedrich and Ortrud attack Elsa to get her to ask the question. Because Friedrich's main point is, if you find out who he is, you'll have power over him and he'll never leave you. Mm-hmm. That's exactly
that's right.
Whereas Ortrud says, if you don't know who he is, he might be somebody scandalous and shameful, and you'll be ashamed of being married to him. It's quite different.
But it's also who Lohengrin is or isn't, because I sometimes think that they would just stop talking, hug her and give her a kiss and forget her. Lohengrin just,
arrive on the scene on a magic swan in the middle of the thing, and the first thing you say is, I'm going to go on only if you never ask me who I am. Well, it sort of begs the question. It's not Joe Schmo who has to come out of the chorus somewhere.
He says, you remember, take her to the window and says, he tries to distract her. He says, listen, smell the perfume, smell nature.
Goes to all the cliches.
Well, yes, he tries.
But I mean, there's also action. I mean, you can also just, Brightster. I mean,
he tries.
But this is where, while I would agree that the characterization is not as complex as it is in other of Wagner's operas, what character is important. This, by the way, is why ultimately it is much better than a well-made play. Because the well-made play would always subject whatever happens to human beings to circumstance. And Wagner goes beyond that. He transcends the well-made play. Ultimately, it is what you are. And this is the most realistic way of looking at it. We cannot be... There are certain people, I'm sure there are certain people you can't fling your arms around and kiss.
Yeah.
I know there are some people I can. Whatever it is, that is there, and it will never change. And I think this emerges more clearly in Lohengrin than actually most other dramatic works that I know. That we are determined by what we are, and we're just going to have to be that way. But it does move out into a much broader realm, because I think it does sort of have references, yet these two people are symbolic of a wider range of experience, and therefore we can interpret this from a social or political point of view as well. That's why it's such it's much more complex opera than it first appears. Yeah.
He does arrive, taking up, but something like Derek said, he does arrive on a swan.
Yeah.
And then he leaves. I'm sorry. Where is he coming from, and where is he going? Is it a Valhalla type of place?
He describes it in infernal land, in detail, and I mean, you could describe it. I mean, one might be able to describe it in Christian terms. In Monsal, that certainly has been seen as an element of a Christian culture. The way he describes it here is it's the land of pure imagination. It's the land from which beauty comes, and it's a land where the artist lives. And in some ways, I think we just have to take it as a metaphor for the sort of the detachment that the artist always has to go through, always has to live in, if he's in order to be what he is.
But it's also no physical passion. It's always men who are pure.
Yes. Well, there's no passion.
He longs for it, obviously, or else he wouldn't come down to earth in the first place.
The sequel to Lohengrin it takes place in. I'm being a little bit fanciful here, but I do mean halfway. The sequel to Lohengrin is Ibsen's The Master Builder. Ibsen's The Master Builder, When Did It Awaken, which deal precisely with these themes, but they deal with them, obviously, spoken drama, and they deal with it more from the point of view of late 19th century psychology. But Ibsen spends all his time creating sort of castles in the air. You could almost call it Monsal that. He creates glaciers, he creates mountain peaks which fall down and destroy the characters who are aspiring to get to them. And in many ways, this is really the sort of a metaphorical description of the same issues we have in Lohengrin. This is another thing about it. Is that really its themes look toward the late 19th century. The themes go forward. The form itself is somewhat archaic. And by the way, that's another reason why I think that it was tremendously popular. Lohengrin was the most popular opera through until about sort of the middle of the 20th century. Right the way at the point where, in fact, public interest in the well-made play began to decline. And if you look at what happens in the spoken theatre after the Second World War, people are going much more to Samuel Beckett, Pinter, Ionesco, the rise of absurdism, and we move away from the well-made play. And the well-made play has not had, I mean, yes, we revive it as a matter of curiosity. And then the great works like Shaw writes within the well-made play tradition. Pinter actually writes well-made plays, just cuts out the exposition, which is a very interesting way of doing it. But the thing is, we're not that interested in, or we haven't been that interested in well-made play. I think actually there are signs that it's beginning to change. I think that you can find signs that people are becoming more interested in the structure of the well-made play, particularly in Paris, where there's been a considerable revival of the well-made play in the last few years.
Simon, is there any... Can we take one more question, please? Okay, let me have the last one. Wagner had already in mind when he wrote Lohengrin that someday he might write Parsifal.
Yes. Oh yeah, Parsifal was in his mind, what's it about, same time, so 1845.
1842 is the first writing down about Parsifal.
Yeah, but then by 1845 he had that great period when he spent a summer reading everything, and he conceived everything with the exception of Tristan and Isolde, which is, that one came later. Actually, aren't you living that question?
Yeah, I tell you, after all this wonderful food for thought, I'm sorry we have to focus on food for the stomach because we're beholden to the kitchen here. And it is our time to go. Can we take two more fast ones?
Yeah, I did think
otherwise we get in trouble.
In answering the question of where Lohengrin came from, where he goes back to, there's a more simple explanation. The essence of chivalry was that there was this group of knights at some central place, King Arthur's court or Montserrat, and their mission was to look for damsels in distress, go out on a mission to rescue them, and then to come back, get ready to do another mission. So on the surface, anyway, that's where he came from, that's where he went back to. And despite all of this traditionism and new kinds of plays that you mentioned after the Second World War, I would maintain this is also a popular theme that occasionally gets broadcast, and we all resonate with, witness the movie Shane and High Noon.
Oh no,
we know nothing about where it comes from.
The mythology is alive and kicking. The only thing that is dated, as far as I'm concerned, is sort of the particular sort of dramatic form in which it happened to be put in this.
Yeah, wonderful.
I don't mind dating anyway, I love it. Yes, Lynn.
Is there anything in Wagner's writings that indicates he knew that Lohengrin was a fairly one-dimensional, shallow figure?
Yeah, there is that. Well, the one that I quoted, it's in a communication to my friends.
Yeah.
And his letters to the guy, it's also quoted in the libretto.
And you know, he was actually faced with a dilemma he could never solve. He just couldn't solve it because his very nature, he is shallow. He's a symbol. He's not a human being. It's a real problem that he's faced. It can't change. It's an existential problem. It just can't change. You see, if he went into a real conflict, we really sort of sense, I want to love this woman, but I just can't make it. That sort of somehow there's something that's stopping him. Then I think probably we would identify with him. But he doesn't really go through that conflict. Whenever there's a chance of a conflict, he pushes it away. It says, smell the perfume that's outside the window. Okay,